The landmark work in British Romanticism, and the one most often studied when being introduced to the movement, is William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's lyrical ballads. Most of the poems were written by Wordsworth, but there are several included by Coleridge, and the two collaborated fruitfully on the project. Lyrical ballads, when it was released, was heavily criticized by the critics of the day. It was a radical departure from neoclassical poetry in many respects. Um, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and especially William Wordsworth were very much against artificial poetry. They wanted to write in the language of the peasant, of the common person, and they wanted to try to use their poetry as an experiment to see how they could convey the profound feeling of common experience through deep poetry. Their themes are not glorious. They are not about knights or chivalry. They're not essays on man or great universal topics. They're unconcerned with politics. They're looking at the feelings and at the hearts of men and women, oftentimes poor, ignored men and women, and seeking to find in common people and common experience a profundity that they thought was often ignored by neoclassical and other earlier poets. They wanted to try to focus on common life and people in the country. And we see this in many poems in the lyrical ballads. We Are Seven, Anecdote for Fathers, and Lucy Gray. Lucy Gray is a poem, if I remember right, it's about a crazy woman. So the topics and themes that they chose were shocking because up until this time, this attitude of actually choosing common life as a subject matter and writing about it in a common, accessible manner was something revolutionary in poetry. For Wordsworth, he despised what he called poetic diction, the high-flung metaphors, the very, very big, elaborate words and allusions to Greco-Roman mythology, which were incomprehensible unless you were a member of the literati. He wanted to write in a way that was accessible to the public, but in a language which still reflected this capacity for deep feelings. He also he does this because he wants to allow the reader to recognize some kind of fundamental truths in the human experience that we can take from common everyday situations. One of the most, when Lyrical Ballads was released for the first time and facing so many criticisms, Coleridge and Wordsworth published a second edition with a very famous preface that was written by Wordsworth. In this preface, he outlines his theory of Romantic poetry and why it is superior to the poetry of his predecessors. All I would like to comment on now is one of the most famous quotes from this preface to Lyrical Ballads, in which he says, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. So for poets like Alexander Pope, John Milton, poetry was very much a profession. You studied the great Greek writers, you studied the great Latin poets, you imitated them until you began to participate in this kind of tradition. It was very much a scholastic kind of tradition and very artificial. Art comes from the word artifice, comes from the word artificial. And for as great as a poet as John Milton is, for as great as a poet as Alexander Pope is, it is very clear that their language is not real language. And of course, I would argue any poetry is not real language, even William Wordsworth. But William Wordsworth really takes exception to this kind of elevated poetic diction, which dominated poetic circles, especially during the neoclassical times. So he talks about the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Many of Wordsworth's poems are occasion pieces. I'll talk about Tintern Abbey. I mentioned it before, where he's viewing these ruins and he's overcome with emotion. He has a poem about where he sees a field of daffodils and he's overcome with emotion. He has a poem, many parts of the prelude. I remember there's one part where he remembers being a child and rowing out on the lake at night and viewing the moon and the mountains and things like this. So he believes that the moment of poetic inspiration comes from these moments of powerful feeling. And this idea of poetic inspiration will be very important for the Romantic poets. For previous poets, poetry was work. Poetry was something that you studied and you perfected. The Romantics established this idea of inspiration, that the poet is somehow divine, and that the poet will receive these spontaneous, overwhelming feelings. So the poet becomes something of a prophet under the Romantic understanding of poetry, who speaks higher moral truths and has a soul that is capable of being filled with God, and for lack of a better way to express it. So Wordsworth writes, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, but these are reflected in tranquility. So there's still a room for art. Obviously, when you're filled with the beauty of nature, you probably aren't going to be able to speak about it rationally or in a well-ordered way. And so the poet needs to have these moments of reflection, of calmness, in order to place these powerful feelings into language and into a message which is understandable and which is accessible. I'd like to read some lines from Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth. Wordsworth has a lot of smaller poems in lyrical ballads. I suggest reading these and maybe comparing them to what you see with Essay on Man and other poems from Pope. But Wordsworth likes to write, and again, simple, not elevated style that is accessible, but is trying to tap into a deep feeling, a deep sympathy shared with all of humanity. So near the end of Tintern Abbey, he writes, and now, with gleams of half-extinguished thought, with many recognitions dim and faint, and somewhat of a sad perplexity, the picture of the mind revives again. So here he's talking about after he leaves the Abbey, and this half-extinguished light of his impressions, what he has experienced on his lonely, solitary walk, begin to return to him. While here I stand, not only with the sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts that in this moment there is life and food for future years. And so I dare to hope, though changed, no doubt, from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains, by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man, flying from something that he dreads, than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature, then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. He goes on, this is a very common theme in Wordsworth. He discusses the overwhelming feeling of pleasure and joy that he took in nature as a child, and how this feeling is gone now. This is very powerful in one of my favorite poem that he wrote, Intimations of Immortality. But Wordsworth always goes back to this idea that this overwhelming feeling of emotions reflected in tranquility. And this is the greatest thing about being an adult, is we do not have access to those spontaneous, overwhelming feelings of joy and of nature that we had when we were children, but we're able to reflect on them and to draw lessons from them in our maturity. And this thought always gives Wordsworth comfort in many of his poems. There are many more aspects of Wordsworth that I would like to discuss, but I simply do not have time. from the famous poem that he has, Michael, which is about a shepherd, a very poor shepherd, and just kind of illustrates again this romantic ideal of celebrating the struggles and the triumphs of common people. And of course, this is reflected, as you can see, in movements like the French Revolution, which many of the Romantic poets would support when it began, but many, like Wordsworth, would move away. But this is a topic for a deeper seminar, and I must move on to, I think I'm going to do Byron next. All right.